presiding in the Senate when the Senate Intelligence Committee released their torture report, and someone had been highly critical, and John, in a very ad hoc and ad-libbed way, came to the floor and stood on the floor and denounced terrorism and denounced torture. No matter whatever else happens in my Senate career, that will be one of the moments I will always treasure.
John is completely in love with the idea of America. He is completely in the tank for democratic values. He's willing to do things other politicians won't do, that somebody should do. He's really good at putting together coalitions. He'll take a political risk. John told me something very important. He says, don't let the loudest guy determine what you do. Have faith in people. Most people are pretty fair-minded, and if they believe you're doing it for the right reasons, they may not even agree with you, but they'll have your back.
John McCain, to me, is someone that embodies this part of humanity, this willingness to put oneself on the line of life and death for an ideal, for something that we hope will better the lives of others.
We went to a refugee camp, Syrian refugees in southern Turkey. And we were warned as we arrived that that morning an official of the United Nations had come, and people had jeered him and taken off their shoes, as is an Arab custom, thrown them at him. They were very angry. So they told us, we have no idea how people are going to respond to a group of American senators. And sure enough, as we rounded the corner, there was a crowd massed, and they were chanting something. And as we got closer, what we realized was they were cheering and chanting John McCain's name. It was a welcome. He not only believes in human rights, he really has done enough for them to see him as their advocate.
I have gone from one end of the world to the other with him. I have seen him with his back against the wall politically. I've seen him take risks that nobody else in my business would take. I've seen him cry with the soldiers. I've seen him make soldiers laugh who are getting their ass shot off. There'll probably never be another guy like this. But as long as there's people around who've been affected by John McCain, I guess he never dies.
If I could ask our friends to come up. That last point was really poignant because John McCain touched so many people's lives. And I'm here representing the McCain Institute. There are so many of us here from Georgia, from other countries, but also from the United States who, in one way or another, were grabbed by John McCain and pushed into the fight. And so I want to hear a couple of stories from some people who worked for John McCain and others who've been inspired or supported by him. Let me start with, I'm just going to introduce people quickly who are all known. Batu Katalia, you all know here in Georgia. Batu was in the first class of Next Generation Leaders for the McCain Institute, among many other things in his Georgian responsibilities. Vladimir Karamurza, I think you all know as well, and someone that John McCain made a particular point of showing support to, especially after the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. David Kramer, who is the head of Freedom House, who worked with me at the McCain Institute for several years, doing human rights and democracy issues, and is now on the board of Freedom House. Dan Twining, the IRI. Dan Twining, who's the president of IRI. I worked with Dan together in the senator's office back in the 90s. And Randy Schuneman, who was his national security advisor in the 2008 campaign, and actually is the person who introduced me to John McCain. So why don't I start with David, and we'll work this way and this way.
I believe the United States has a special responsibility to champion human rights in all places, for all peoples, in all times. I believe that all my life, writes John McCain in his last book, The Restless Wave. It's who we are, the right to life and liberty, to be governed by consent and ruled by laws, to have equal justice and protection of property. Those values are core of our national identity. Human rights are not our invention, McCain writes. They don't represent standards from which particular cultures or religions can be exempted. They are universal. They exist above the state and beyond history. They cannot be rescinded by one government any more than they can be granted by another. That's our creed. Human rights advocacy isn't idealism. It's the truest kind of realism. He goes on to say, if we don't accept that the nature of a regime shapes its conduct, we risk profoundly misreading international politics. We expect better behavior from despots than we have reason to. We miss what can be the most transformational force for good in the world, the anger of oppressed people and their hope, their imperishable hope for change. We don't always appreciate as we should the values others place on the public statements of American officials. It matters what we say and what we don't say. The U.S. remains the world's leading power, and when our leaders speak, governments and people take notice. There is nothing so rewarding as contributing, even if only in the most modest way, to the defense of another human being's dignity, all the more so when the person is otherwise a stranger to you. Most often, all I've called for is that the government of the world's leading democracy and its relations with oppressive regimes speak loudly, persistently, and unambiguously in support of the brave souls who protest them. But when courageous people call on us by name, when they plead for our solidarity in peaceful demonstrations against their government, when they write their protest banners in English, that is a good indication that we can and should do more to support their cause. Even the smallest gestures in support of the hardest causes, the ones that seem futile, mean something to those struggling in them, and they are the ones that end up meaning the most to you. I've become fond of late in quoting Edmund Burke, who famously said, "The only thing necessary for the success of evil is for good men to do nothing." John McCain was evil's greatest enemy and freedom's best friend.
Vladimir, if you'd say a few words about John McCain's relationship with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kurt. Well, I've been in politics for quite a few years now, and as many of us know, one of the rarest qualities, unfortunately, among political leaders are foresight, commitment to principle, and the willingness to speak the truth. Senator John McCain had all three of those qualities. He was so right about Vladimir Putin so early on, when most Western leaders were still, rolling out a red carpet for Mr. Putin and praising and hailing this new energetic official who would bring order and stability after the supposedly chaotic 1990s. John McCain sounded a public warning in February of 2000. This was when Putin was not even president of Russia yet. He was only on the way. Sounded a public warning about the upcoming authoritarianism. And he used the phrase, making the trains run on time, which was an unmistakable historical reference to Mussolini's regime in Italy. A few years later, he was also the first to make a public warning about the Kremlin's coming aggressive designs abroad. He understood very well the direct link between domestic oppression and external aggressiveness that so many Western leaders chose not to notice. And in 2008, just after the attack on Georgia, he said that Ukraine will be next, and he was dismissed as some kind of alarmist who is not living in reality. This was 6 years before Mr. Putin did what he did in Crimea and in the Donbass. He was willing not only to speak the truth about oppression and authoritarianism in the furthest corners of the globe, as David has just said, but he was also willing to call to publicly shame those Western governments, including administrations of his own party, which he saw as too accommodating and too appeasing to the regime and the Kremlin, whether it was George W. Bush, who would look into Putin's eyes and see his soul, or Barack Obama, who would declare a reset. One of the biggest lies that has been put out by the Kremlin and by the Kremlin's propaganda machine about John McCain, both in his life and in the last few weeks after his death, was that he was somehow an enemy of Russia. These are the headlines that greeted his passing 2 weeks ago. Nothing could be further from the truth. John McCain was never an enemy of Russia. He was certainly an enemy of the kleptocrats, the crooks, and the former KGB officers in the Kremlin who are stealing from the Russian people and who are denying the basic rights of the Russian people. He was certainly an enemy of them, and a passionate and outspoken enemy. But I can tell you, as somebody who's been involved in the pro-democracy movement in Russia for many, many years, we had no bigger friend in Washington, on Capitol Hill, and I would say in the Western world in general, than Senator John McCain. You know, however busy the Senate schedule was, he would always find time to speak out for Russian political prisoners, to work on legislation that was important to us, such as the Magnitsky Act. Remember the last time Boris Nemtsov was in Washington? It was in January of 2014. Walking down the corridor of the Russell Building, and we saw Senator McCain and with his staff walking towards us. And, you know, he saw us and he looked at his assistants and he said, you know, whatever I have next on the schedule, please call and apologize. And he looked at Boris and said, okay, come on in, let's talk. So we came in his office. We spoke, I guess, for maybe 20 or 25 minutes. He tried to plead with Boris Nemtsov not to return. He said, the dangers are just too high. You shouldn't go back. And Boris said, yeah, I know what the dangers are, but you know, it's my country. I'm not giving up this fight. I have to go back. And so he did, and so just over a year later, he was dead, gunned down in front of the Kremlin. And Senator McCain was one of those who led on the legislation to designate a street in front of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. as Boris Nemtsov Plaza. It was officially designated in February of this year. He was too ill already to travel to the ceremony, but he issued a public statement in support of this designation. And 2 weeks ago, a little less, when there was the service of the National Cathedral in Washington, most of the guests who came to the service would drive up Wisconsin Avenue. And they would see that contrast that I was just talking about between John McCain being an enemy of the Kremlin but not of Russia. You would see the Russian embassy on Wisconsin Avenue as one of the very few, if not the only embassy in Washington, D.C. that refused to lower the flag in solidarity when Senator McCain passed away. But then you would see in front of the main gate of the Russian embassy those signs reading Boris Nemtsov Plaza, in honor and in memory of one of the greatest patriots of modern Russia. So I just want to say that, you know, a lot of people in the last 2 weeks have been talking about how much John McCain meant for America and for Americans and what he would be remembered for in his own country. I can say, as somebody from very far away, that, you know, John McCain never attained formally the office of the presidency. He sought it twice. He didn't succeed. But I think his voice had the resonance, the importance, and the moral authority which many heads of state, many heads of government around the world would envy. And I think his voice is going to be missed, not only in the state of Arizona, not only in Washington, but as I don't need to tell people here in Georgia, in the furthest corners of the globe. And I will always consider it one of the greatest blessings, one of the greatest privileges of my life to have worked with him.
Thank you, Vladimir.
For those of us, it's working, yeah. For those of us who've been living some part of our life in Soviet Union, and even till today in post-Soviet space, we often hear this mantra that the politics is a dirty business and only wrong guys are going there. This is a part of this propaganda fake news to prevent good people entering in politics. And Senator McCain, for me, was a person who was proving just the opposite. Politics is a good thing to do, to be done by the good people for the good purposes. And that was a lifetime experience for me to have a personal relation with the Senator McCain. When I arrived in Washington as an ambassador in 2009, it was an interesting period, reshuffling quite a bit of American foreign policy with the reset of Russia and having some kind of illusions that Russia might be a partner or a positive player, while a year ago Russia occupied Georgian territories. So it was not easy to make Georgia case at that time. I was trying to spend most of my time on the Capitol Hill, I followed the advice of a good friend of mine, Ambassador John Teft, who advised me to spend most of my time in Washington on the Capitol Hill. Thank you, John, for this. And it was not easy because most of the doors were shut or some other priorities were there. And what usually Senator McCain would do, of course, he would meet on every possible occasion. We would request meeting with him, but after the formal meeting, he would take me like a small child with the hand, taking down to the corridors of the Capitol Hill or where the voting process was going on, and literally was introducing me to every key senator and the congressman with a very brief introduction. You know, he represents the country who fights with Russia, and we have to stand with Georgians. So he was following truly his statement during 2008 war when he said that today we are Lord Georgians. So at this conference, you hear his voice. Everyone who speaks in support of my country, I believe, voicing Senator McCain's values and Senator McCain's ideas. And this will remain with my country until we will fight together to regain our freedom finally. Thank you very much.
Right. So I started working for Senator McCain in 1995. And what he was doing then, one of his great initiatives was trying to normalize the U.S. relationship with Vietnam, with which we had fought a war. America had ended in 1972, but we had had no relationship with Vietnam essentially since then. And it was vintage McCain, right? It was looking forward, not backwards. It was understanding that we had a geopolitical interest in the future of this relationship with Vietnam, but also a moral imperative to end the war for so many Americans who were still fighting it in their minds, etc. With respect to Georgia, it's quite interesting because Senator McCain understood that the real test of this rules-based order, this democratic world that had emerged after the end of Soviet totalitarianism, the test of that system was not simply whether it was good for big, powerful, rich countries like the United States. The real test of that system was whether it protected the safety and interests of small countries like Georgia, right? Which is a much harder test. But his view was that the work of building the free world would not be complete until everybody in the free world could enjoy the benefits of that system the way the United States did. And I think we should think about that today when we think about this much more competitive world. Senator McCain would want us to make sure that in this more competitive world, we were not simply looking after America first, right? But that we were thinking about the safety and security of that world for our many friends in it, including small countries like Georgia. Senator McCain also was quite interesting. I was in lots of meetings with lots of world leaders with him, and he would often talk about Georgia. And you know, many Americans flatter ourselves into thinking that we're kind of a role model and an example for the world, right? He would cite the example of Georgia to the leaders of other countries and say, look at what these Georgians have done. Look at how they are standing up for themselves. Look at how they are throwing off this supposition that countries that, for better or for worse, border Russia are somehow condemned to be part of the Russian Empire in whatever form it may take. Say, look at these Georgians. We should be more like them, right? Very inspiring to hear that. You know, I think I will just close with the thought that one thing he really liked about Georgia was its quality as an underdog. Senator McCain was always an underdog. He never won a presidential election. He was always fighting sometimes these hopeless causes, right, in American politics, to clean up corrupt money, to take on vested interests. And he saw the same qualities in this plucky little democracy in Georgia that I think he really valued in his own life and career. I don't know what heaven looks like. I suspect for him it's a mix of his ranch out in Arizona and some of the most beautiful parts of this country. Thank you.
So I was privileged to be with Senator McCain on his first trip 21 years ago to this country in 1997. I was also there in 2008, as Batu referred to, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when he said, "We are all Georgians now." But I thought I'd share a little bit of a story that doesn't reflect so much on the courage and vision and honor and integrity of Senator McCain that we know so well, but also shows a slightly different, playful side that some of you may have heard me tell the other night. But it was in 2006 when he brought a group of senators, 6 total, I believe, and their wives to Georgia. And we didn't just do the meetings in Tbilisi and that was it. We went to Batumi, went jet skiing, a scramble to find swimsuits for all the senators to play in the Black Sea. We visited Senaki, but we went up to Ushguli, a town high in Svaneti, the highest populated town, highest elevation in Europe. And it was a very hot morning, went up there by helicopter, and of course, it being Georgia, many of us had been celebrating a little bit too hard and too late the night before in Batumi. And so we're sweating under the hot sun and seeing the display of Svan culture and dancing. And it's over about 10:30. I'm thinking, great, now we can get back into the shade and get somewhere cool. And of course, out comes the tray of cha-cha. And they bring the tray around, and Senator McCain grabs one, and not waiting for a Georgian toast, immediately downs it and turns to me, indicates I should grab one, and I'm standing there, and it's really the last thing I wanted was a shot of Svan Cha-Cha at 10:30 in the morning, which, if you don't know it, it bears a slight affinity to turpentine. And he looked at me and he said, "Drink it, you pussy." So I did, not having much choice, and Cindy McCain, his wife, was standing next to him and looked at me a little bit sympathetically and said, "Once a fighter jock, always a fighter jock." So there's that side of John McCain too, but I'll leave you with this. The morning we said goodbye to Senator McCain, I took a cab from my apartment in Virginia to the National Cathedral. Actually not a cab, an Uber. So it was no mystery to the Uber driver where I was going, dressed in a black suit, destination National Cathedral. And he said to me, "Are you going to the service for Senator McCain?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm from Afghanistan, and our whole country has been paying attention this week. We miss Senator McCain. He meant so much to us. He worked so hard for us." And we got to the cathedral, and I go to get out, and he says, "Thank you." And he wasn't thanking me for the ride. He was thanking me for Senator McCain. And so wherever he is today, high above the mountains of Kazbeki, I say to Senator McCain, thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you all very much. I'm sure we could all have a story. Everyone in this audience could probably tell a story about Senator McCain. We're going to say thank you again one more time. If you would join me in a round of applause for the life and contributions of Senator McCain, and we'll move on then to bring the President to the stage for conversation.